Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, listen to me today. There comes a time in every life when the ground beneath you shakes, when the path ahead turns crooked, when the very thing you were holding on to slips through your fingers. You didn't plan for this. You didn't ask for this. And yet here you are, stumbling. Maybe you stumbled into heartbreak. Maybe you stumbled into loss. Maybe you stumbled into rejection, betrayal, failure, or fear. So strong it takes your breath away. But hear me, just because you stumbled doesn't mean you're out. Just because you tripped doesn't mean your journey is over. Oh, I feel this for somebody today. I need you to understand that God does not measure you by how you stumble. He measures you by how you stand. The stumble is part of the story, but it is not the end of your story. Because deep inside of you, there is something stronger than the fall. There is something greater than the struggle. There's something unshakable in you, something that refuses to quit. And that, my friends, is what we are talking about today, how to be steady in the stumble. I came to tell somebody, you may be wobbling, but you are not weak. You may be weary, but you are not done. The stumble is not your destruction, it's your preparation. What the enemy meant to break you, God will use to build you. What life threw at you to stop you, God will turn into the very thing that strengthens you. So if you feel like you're falling, if you feel like you're barely holding on, don't lose hope, because the God who called you is the God who will catch you. The God who started this work in you is the God who will complete it. Somebody say, I may stumble, but I will stand. Somebody declare, I may fall, but I will rise. Ooh, I feel a breakthrough coming in this place today. It's time to shift your perspective. It's time to shake off the shame. It's time to step forward, steady in the stumble, knowing that God's strength is made perfect in your weakness. Are you ready? Are you hungry for this word? Because today I believe chains are about to break. Faith is about to rise, and you will walk out of here stronger than you've ever been before. There are moments in life when we trip, when we lose our footing, when things don't go as planned. Maybe it was a decision you regret, an opportunity you missed, a mistake that haunts you, or a season of life that feels like a complete disaster. And in those moments, the enemy whispers in your ear, you have failed. Think about a child learning to walk. They take a step, then another, and then boom, they tumble to the ground. But do we look at that child and say, oh no, they've failed, they'll never walk? No, we understand that stumbling is part of learning. Falling is part of growing. It is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that they are moving forward. And if we understand that about a child, why do we forget it about ourselves? Why do we assume that every misstep, every setback, every difficult season is the end of the road? The enemy wants you to believe that because you stumble, you are unworthy, incapable, and disqualified. But the truth is, stumbling is proof that you are in motion. It means you are striving, pushing, reaching, growing. It means you are daring to walk by faith, even when the ground feels uncertain. If you never stumble, it means you aren't stepping into anything new. It means you are playing it too safe, staying in your comfort zone, refusing to move forward. When you look at the great men and women of faith in the Bible, you don't see a list of perfect people who never fell. No, you see people who stumbled, but they didn't stop. David stumbled into sin, but he was still a man after God's own heart. Peter stumbled in fear, denying Jesus 3 times, but he was still called to build the church. Moses stumbled in doubt, yet he still led God's people to freedom. Every person God used in a mighty way had moments where they tripped, where they wavered, where they struggled. But their stumbling did not cancel their calling. And let me tell you, your stumble does not cancel your calling either. Just because you fell doesn't mean you have to stay down. Just because you made a mistake doesn't mean you are a mistake. Just because you slipped doesn't mean God has given up on you. The grace of God is greater than your greatest failure. His mercy reaches further than your deepest mistake. His love does not waver just because you wobbled. Too often we judge ourselves too quickly. We let one bad moment define our entire identity. We allow one season of struggle to convince us that we are unworthy. But if you could see yourself through God's eyes, you would see that your stumble does not mean you are unworthy. It means you are human. It means you are still in process. It means there is still a purpose for your life. Have you ever seen a runner trip in the middle of a race? They don't just sit on the track and cry about how they messed up. No, they get back up and keep running. They may have lost a little time, but they are still in the race. And as long as they are still in the race, there is still a chance to finish strong. This is why you cannot let your stumble define you. You are more than your worst moment. You are greater than your biggest mistake. You may have fallen, but you are still in motion. You may have tripped, but you are still breathing. And as long as there is breath in your body, there is purpose in your life. There is something powerful about weakness, something we often fail to understand. The world teaches us that weakness is something to be ashamed of, something to hide, something that disqualifies us from greatness. But the kingdom of God operates differently. In the hands of God, weakness is not a liability, it is an opportunity. It is in our weakest moments that His strength is revealed. Think about it. If you could do everything on your own, if you never needed help, never struggled, never felt pain, where would God fit into the picture? If you had all the answers, you wouldn't seek Him. If you never stumbled, you wouldn't rely on Him. But when life hits you hard, when you come to the end of yourself, when your own strength isn't enough, that is when you truly experience the power of God. That is when you begin to understand that His strength is greater than your struggle. His power is greater than your problem. His grace is greater than your guilt. We see it over and over again in Scripture. God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He takes what seems broken, what seems insignificant, what seems incapable, and He breathes purpose into it. Look at Gideon, a man hiding in fear, believing he was the least of the least, yet God called him a mighty warrior. Look at Paul, a man who struggled with a thorn in his flesh, yet he declared, "When I am weak, then I am strong." Look at Jesus Himself, beaten, mocked, hanging on a cross, in what appeared to be the ultimate display of weakness, yet through that very act, the power of salvation was unleashed upon the world. We are conditioned to think that we must always be strong, always be in control, always have it together. But God is not looking for people who are willing to surrender. He is looking for people who will acknowledge that they don't have all the answers, people who will admit that they need Him, because when we bring our weakness to God, He doesn't reject us, He restores us. When we lay our burdens at His feet, He doesn't turn us away, He lifts us up. Some of the greatest victories in life come not when we prove our own strength, but when we lean on His. There are battles you cannot fight on your own, storms you cannot weather in your own power. But when you stop trying to handle it all yourself, when you stop pretending that you've got it all under control, that is when you unlock the supernatural strength of God. That is when you find that even in your weakest moment, you are still standing, still moving forward, still pressing on, not because of your own ability, but because His power is working through you. Many people think that struggling means they lack faith. They think that if they were truly strong, they wouldn't feel weary, they wouldn't have doubts, they wouldn't face discouragement. But faith is not the absence of struggle. Faith is trusting God in the middle of the struggle. Faith is saying, "Lord, I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but I know you will sustain me. Faith is understanding that God doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be willing. If you've been feeling weak, if you've been feeling like you can't go on, if you've been wondering how you're going to make it, I need you to understand that you are in the perfect position for God to show his power. Your weakness is the very thing that invites his strength. Your struggle is the very thing that draws his presence closer, because God is not impressed by human strength. He is moved by surrender. And when you let go of your need to control everything, when you stop trying to do it all on your own, you will find that his grace is sufficient, his power is unshakable, and his strength will carry you through. Life will knock you down. There will be moments when you are hit so hard that you question everything, your purpose, your calling, your faith. Maybe you have been betrayed by someone you trusted. Maybe you've lost something you thought you couldn't live without. Maybe the dream you worked so hard for seems to be slipping through your fingers. And in that moment, when the weight of life is pressing down on you, the question is not whether you will stumble. The question is, how will you respond? Because the truth is, stumbling is inevitable. There is not a single person who has walked this earth who has not faced hardship, who has not felt the sting of disappointment, who has not questioned if they have the strength to keep going. But what separates those who rise from those who remain stuck is not the absence of struggle, it is the response to the struggle. It is what you do after you stumble that determines your recovery. The enemy would love nothing more than for you to stay down. He would love for you to believe that one mistake defines you, that one failure is the end, that one broken season means your purpose is over. He wants you to wallow in shame, to drown in self-pity, to believe the lie that because you fell, you are no longer worthy of getting back up. But let me tell you something. The power of God does not rest in those who never fall. It rests in those who choose to get back up again and again, no matter how many times they've been knocked down. There are two ways you can respond when life trips you up. You can allow the stumble to define you, or you can allow it to refine you. You can either sit in the dust of your disappointment, or you can rise from the ashes with renewed strength. The choice is yours. You may not have control over what happened to you, but you have control over how you respond to it. Think about Job, a man who lost everything, his wealth, his family, his health. If anyone had a reason to give up, it was him. But instead of cursing God, instead of allowing his pain to consume him, he chose to trust. He chose to stand on the promise that his story was not over. And in the end, God restored him beyond what he had before. His recovery wasn't just about survival, it was about perseverance. Now, look at Peter. He walked with Jesus, saw his miracles, was part of his inner circle, and yet when the pressure was on, when his faith was tested, he denied even knowing Christ. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. That stumble could have defined him. He could have let guilt consume him. He could have run away and never looked back. But instead, when Jesus called him again, he responded. He allowed grace to redeem him, and he stepped into his calling with even greater strength. What happened to you is not the end of your story. The pain, the failure, the setback, it's not permanent. But the way you respond in this moment will determine what happens next. Will you let the stumble turn into stagnation, or will you rise, shake the dust off, and walk forward with greater wisdom and faith? Your response determines your recovery. If you respond with fear, you will stay stuck. If you respond with bitterness, you will remain broken. But if you respond with faith, if you respond with perseverance, if you respond with the belief that God is still working, then you will see restoration beyond what you ever imagined. Because the stumble is not your story, it's just a chapter. And what God is writing next is greater than anything you have lost. Purpose is one of the most powerful forces in existence. It is the reason you were created, the reason you are still here, the reason life cannot break you, no matter how many times you stumble. Purpose is not something that disappears because of a bad season. It is not something that gets erased because of a mistake. Purpose is embedded in you, placed there by God before you even took your first breath, and nothing, not failure, not loss, not rejection, not even your own doubts can take it away. But when life hits hard, it is easy to believe that purpose has left you. When the job falls through, when the relationship ends, when the dream seems so far out of reach, the enemy starts whispering, "See, you've lost it. You've messed up too much. You missed your chance." And if you're not careful, you will begin to believe that your stumble somehow disqualifies you from the calling on your life. But that is a lie. Purpose does not die because of a difficult season. Look at Joseph. He had a dream from God, a clear vision of his future, yet his life took a path that looked nothing like the promise. Betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked away in a prison cell. Everything in his life looked like failure. If anyone had a reason to believe his purpose was gone, it was Joseph. But what Joseph did not know at the time was that even in the prison, his purpose was still alive. Even in the pit, even in the false accusations, even in the years of waiting, purpose was still working. What seemed like delays were actually divine setups. What looked like setbacks were actually part of the process. And when the time was right, the very thing that tried to destroy him became the thing that positioned him for destiny. The same is true for you. Just because you are in a difficult place does not mean your purpose has disappeared. Just because you have stumbled does not mean the promise is gone. Your mistakes cannot cancel what God has already written. Your past cannot undo what God has declared over your future. The enemy may try to shake you, but he cannot erase the calling on your life. Think about Moses. He was called to be a deliverer, yet he fled into the wilderness in shame after killing a man. For 40 years he lived as a shepherd, far away from the palace where he once stood. He probably thought his purpose had passed him by. He probably thought his mistake had ruined everything. But purpose is not bound by time. The same God who called him before was the same God who met him at the burning bush and said, "Now is the time." His mistake did not cancel his calling. His purpose was still alive. God does not change his mind about you. He does not revoke his calling just because you had a setback. The purpose he placed inside of you is still there, waiting for you to rise up and walk in it. You may have stumbled, but purpose is still calling your name. You may have lost your way for a season, but purpose is still waiting for you to take the next step. The enemy wants you to believe that your failures have defined you, that your past has written the final chapter, that your struggles have disqualified you. But if purpose could be destroyed by failure, none of us would have a future. Purpose is not fragile. It is not dependent on perfection. It is not shaken by the mistakes you've made or the seasons you've walked through. It is alive inside of you, waiting to be embraced, waiting to be pursued, waiting for you to believe that what God has for you is still within reach. Life is not about walking a perfect, unshaken path. It is about moving forward even when the road is unsteady. It is about pressing on even when your steps feel uncertain. It is about refusing to let the stumble stop you from reaching what God has for you. The truth is, There will be times when you feel like you are barely holding it together. There will be moments when your faith feels weak, when your confidence wavers, when doubt creeps in and makes you wonder if you have the strength to keep going. But hear this, progress is still progress, no matter how unsteady it looks. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply putting one foot in front of the other. You may not be running, you may not even be walking with confidence, but if you are moving forward, even with trembling hands and a weary heart, you are still in the fight. And as long as you refuse to quit, as long as you refuse to stay stuck in the place of your pain, you will make it to the other side. The enemy wants you to believe that if you are not moving fast, you are not moving at all. He wants you to think that if you are not moving at all, he wants you to think that if you don't have it all figured out, you should just give up. But faith is not about speed, it is about endurance. The race is not given to the swift, but to the one who keeps going, the one who refuses to turn back, the one who understands that victory is not about how perfect your journey looks, but about how determined you are to finish it. Look at the life of Abraham. God gave him a promise, a vision of something greater, a future beyond what he could imagine. But the road to that promise was not smooth. There were delays, detours, and moments where it seemed impossible. He made mistakes along the way. He stumbled in doubt. But what mattered was that he kept walking, he kept believing, he kept trusting that the God who spoke the promise would be faithful to fulfill it. And because he refused to stop moving, he stepped into everything God had for him. Maybe you feel like you're walking unsteadily right now. Maybe you don't feel as strong as you used to. Maybe you don't have the same fire, the same confidence, the same certainty. But hear me, it's okay to wobble as long as you keep walking. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to feel unsure. What matters is that you don't let the uncertainty paralyze you. What matters is that you keep taking steps, even if they are small. Think about Peter stepping out of the boat. The waves were crashing, the wind was raging, and yet for a moment he walked on water. But then fear crept in. He saw the storm, he felt the wind, and he began to sink. But notice this, he was still closer to Jesus than the ones who stayed in the boat. Even though he wobbled, even though he lost focus for a moment, he still had the courage to step out. And because he stepped out, Jesus reached down and lifted him up. This is why you cannot let the fear of falling keep you from moving forward. You cannot let the fear of making mistakes keep you from stepping into your destiny. You may feel unsteady, but you are still standing. You may feel weak, but his strength is holding you up. Every step you take, no matter how uncertain, is bringing you closer to the promise. Every move forward, no matter how slow, is leading you to the breakthrough. So don't measure your progress by how smooth the journey looks. Don't compare your pace to someone else's. Don't let the wobble convince you that you are not worthy of the walk. Because the victory does not belong to those who never stumble. It belongs to those who refuse to stop.